The waiting room of the municipal land office in the river town of São Gabriel was a purgatory, painted in peeling beige. The air conditioning had died sometime in the 1990s, replaced by 3 ceiling fans that wobbled precariously on their stems, churning the stagnant humid air without cooling it. The room smelled of carbon paper, stale coffee, and the unique, sour perspiration of men waiting to pay taxes they couldn't afford. Captain Marcus stood near the back wall, his shoulders brushing the plaster. He hated these places. To a man conditioned for the kinetic freedom of the jungle, the slow, grinding death of bureaucracy was a form of torture. He was there simply to renew the registration on his boat, a mundane administrative task that had already consumed 4 hours of his life. Beside him, Max sat in a perfect heel position. The German Shepherd was the only creature in the room not complaining about the heat. He simply panted rhythmically, his dark sable fur absorbing the humidity, his eyes tracking the fly buzzing around a flickering fluorescent bulb. The room wasn't just for boat licenses today. At the front, behind a heavy wooden counter scarred by decades of elbows and pens, a municipal auction was taking place. This wasn't the high-stakes drama of a cattle auction or the rapid-fire energy of a stock exchange. It was the disposal of unwanted things. The county was selling off tax-delinquent parcels of land, plots that had been seized from bankrupt mining companies, failed homesteaders, or families that had simply vanished into the forest. Marcus watched with mild disinterest. Most of the lots were snapped up quickly by representatives of logging consortiums or local cattle barons. They were buying acreage for the timber or the grazing rights, paying thousands of dollars without even looking at the maps. They were carving up the jungle like a carcass. Then, the clerk, a man with a stained shirt and eyes deadened by decades of paperwork, picked up a thin file folder. He sighed, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "Lot 7 Bravo," the clerk announced, his voice devoid of enthusiasm. 2.5 acres in the upper tributary sector. Access is difficult. Listed as swamp and secondary growth. No mineral surveys. No timber value. Previous owner deceased in 1985. Opening bid is the back taxes. $5. A ripple of laughter went through the room. A cattle rancher in the front row spat tobacco juice into a cup. "You'd have to pay me to take that mud pit," the rancher joked. "It's underwater half the year, and the mosquitoes there are big enough to carry off a calf." "It's a malaria trap," another man muttered. "Let the jungle have it." Marcus was about to turn away, to go back to staring at the wall until his number was called, when he glanced at the large topographical map pinned to the wall behind the clerk. He narrowed his eyes behind his sunglasses. He knew the sector. It was about 4 miles upriver from his own shack, in a dense, tangled area that the locals avoided. But Marcus didn't look at land like a farmer. He looked at it like a tactician. He stepped closer, ignoring the stares of the men who wondered why the giant gringo was moving. studied the contour lines on the map. The lot wasn't a swamp. The rancher was wrong. The contour lines showed a sharp rise in elevation, a knoll or a hillock surrounded by low ground. It was a defensible position. It had natural moats on 3 sides, and right in the center of the plot, marked by a tiny, faded symbol from a survey done in the 1940s, was a square, black icon. Structure. Not a house. Houses were marked with open squares. This was a solid black square. That meant concrete or steel, military or industrial. $5, the clerk repeated, looking ready to toss the file into the trash bin. Going once, going twice. Marcus raised his hand. I'll take it, he said. His voice, grave and accented, cut through the murmurs of the room. The silence that followed was heavy. The ranchers turned to look at him. They saw the scar on his neck, the combat boots, the wolf dog. They smirked. The stupid foreigner was buying the swamp. Sold, the clerk said quickly, slamming a stamp onto the paper before Marcus could change his mind. Cash only. No refunds. You buy the land, you buy the liability. Marcus walked to the counter. He pulled a $5 bill from his pocket, a crisp Lincoln. He placed it on the wood. It was less than the cost of a coffee in the city. The clerk handed him the deed. It was a single sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges. You bought yourself a headache, mister, the clerk muttered. There's no road. You'll have to hack your way in. I have a machete, Marcus replied. He took the paper. He didn't wait for his boat registration. He signaled Max, and they walked out into the blinding sunlight of the street. Outside, Yara was waiting by the truck, an old, battered pickup Marcus used for town runs. She was leaning against the fender, arms crossed, looking at the jungle. When she saw Marcus approach with the paper in his hand, she raised an eyebrow. You look like you did something, she said. I bought some land, Marcus admitted. Yara took the paper. She read the location. Her eyes widened. Sector 7. Marcus, that's the dead zone. The old people say the ground there is sour. Nothing grows. The rubber tappers used to go there and get sick. You paid money for that? $5, Marcus said. You overpaid, she quipped, handing the deed back. What are we going to do with a swamp? We're going to see what's on the hill, Marcus said, climbing into the driver's seat. The map says there's something there. The drive to the drop-off point took an hour. The hike took 3. The clerk hadn't lied about the access. There was no trail. The jungle here was a wall of unha de gato thorns and rotting vegetation. The heat was suffocating, trapped under the canopy. The mosquitoes were indeed vicious, swarming in black clouds that Max snapped at with his jaws. Yara moved through the bush with her usual grace, using her machete to clear vines, but even she was sweating and annoyed. This is foolishness, she muttered, slashing a vine. We are walking into a hole to find nothing. But Marcus watched the ground. As they pushed deeper, the mud began to give way to harder packed earth. The elevation was rising. The trees changed from water-loving mangroves to hardwoods that needed dry roots. We're climbing, Marcus said. The swamp is behind us. They crested a small ridge. The jungle opened up slightly, revealing a plateau that had been swallowed by 50 years of neglect. And there, in the center of the clearing, strangled by strangler figs and covered in a thick carpet of moss, was the shape. It wasn't a house. It was a long, semi-cylindrical structure made of corrugated steel and concrete, a Quonset hut, the classic architecture of World War II military outposts. It looked like a giant, rusted metal whale beached in the Amazon. Marcus stopped. He wiped the sweat from his eyes. He recognized the design. The U.S. military had built hundreds of these across the Pacific, and apparently down here during the rubber boom, when the Allies needed tires for the war machine. This was a rubber soldier outpost, abandoned and forgotten by history. It was rusted, dented, and looked ready to collapse. But to Marcus, who saw the world in terms of potential fortifications, it was beautiful. "What is that?" Yara asked, staring at the alien metal shape. "That," Marcus said, walking toward it, "is a fortress." He approached the massive sliding doors at the front. They were welded shut by oxidation. There was a padlock on a hasp, a piece of heavy iron that had turned into a lump of red rust. Marcus didn't use a key. He didn't have one. He used the flat of his boot. He kicked the rotted wood of the door frame next to the lock. The timber shattered. The hasp fell off. He put his shoulder against the steel door and pushed. Max barked, sensing the effort. Yara stepped in beside him, putting her shoulder against the metal. Together, they shoved. The door shrieked, a sound of metal tearing against metal that sent birds flying from the trees for miles around. It slid open 6 inches, just enough for a flashlight beam. Marcus shined his light into the darkness. The air that drifted out was cool, smelling of concrete and old grease. The interior was vast, and it wasn't empty. Marcus saw shapes under tarps. He saw shelves lining the curved walls. He saw the glint of glass and brass. $5, Marcus whispered to himself. He had bought a time capsule. Yara looked at him, then at the dark interior. "It smells like ghosts," she said. "No," Marcus corrected, squeezing through the gap. "It smells like a project." He stepped inside. The echo of his boots on the concrete floor sounded solid. This wasn't just a shed. This was a foundation. And for a man looking to build something that would last, the foundation was everything. The interior of the Quonset hut was a cathedral of forgotten industry. Once Marcus managed to jam the sliding doors open wide enough to let the daylight in, the true scale of his $5 purchase became apparent. The curved, corrugated steel ceiling soared 20 feet high, supported by steel ribs that, despite the surface rust, remained structurally sound. The floor was a single massive slab of poured concrete, cracked in places by intruding roots, but level and solid. It was cool inside, a welcome respite from the boiling jungle heat outside. Yara walked through the space, her hand brushing against the canvas tarps that covered the shapes in the center of the room. She wasn't looking at the architecture. She was looking at the ghosts. "This wasn't a barracks," she whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the vast metal chamber. Soldiers don't leave this much behind. She pulled a tarp off a large waist-high object. Dust billowed up, dancing in the light beams. Underneath was a diesel generator. Not a modern plastic-cased portable unit, but a massive cast-iron beast from the 1940s, built when machines were designed to outlast their owners. It was covered in grease and grime, but the metal beneath was intact. Beside it were workbenches lined with tools, heavy wrenches, vices, hydraulic jacks, all neatly arranged, now frozen in a layer of red oxidation. Marcus moved to the back of the hut. He found a wall of filing cabinets. He pulled a drawer open. The paper files inside had turned to mush, destroyed by humidity and insects, but among the debris were rolls of waterproof map tubes. He pulled one out and unrolled it on a workbench. It was a geological survey map of the region, dated 1943. It was stamped U.S. Rubber Reserve Corps, classified. The map didn't show enemy positions. It showed water tables. It showed mineral deposits. It showed that the Americans who built this place weren't just looking for rubber. They were looking for what lay beneath the rubber. Max was busy in the corner. The dog was sniffing at a series of large glass carboys, heavy jugs used for storing chemicals. He sneezed, backing away. "Careful, Max," Marcus warned. "Don't knock anything over." Marcus inspected the jars. They were empty, but the residue at the bottom was crystalline and blue. Water testing reagents. This place had been a laboratory, a field station for testing the purity of something vital. The discovery phase was interrupted by a sound that didn't belong in the past. It was the high-pitched, angry whine of a modern high-performance boat engine. Not the slow chug-chug of a river barge, but the scream of a twin-engine interceptor. Max's head snapped toward the open door. He let out a low, warning growl, the hair on his back standing up. "Visitors," Marcus said, his hand instinctively going to the pistol concealed at his waist. "Stay here, Yara." Marcus walked out of the darkness of the hut into the blinding afternoon sun. He stood at the top of the hill, looking down toward the riverbank where they had left their own battered skiff. A sleek, white fiberglass speedboat was maneuvering toward the muddy bank. It looked like a spaceship compared to the wooden canoes of the locals. It had tinted windows, radar, and two massive Mercury engines on the back. The boat beached itself with a crunch of fiberglass on gravel. A pilot in a uniform stayed at the wheel. A second man jumped out. He was the anomaly. In a place where men wore sweat-stained rags and carried machetes, this man was wearing a suit. A lightweight, gray linen suit, a crisp white shirt, and expensive leather loafers that were immediately ruined as he stepped into 6 inches of black river mud. He didn't look bothered. He adjusted his sunglasses and looked up the hill. He saw Marcus. The man smiled. It was a practiced, predatory smile, white teeth flashing against a tanned face. He began to climb the hill, slipping on the vegetation, sweating profusely, but maintaining an air of absolute confidence. Marcus waited. He stood with his arms crossed, blocking the entrance to the hut. Max sat beside him, a silent statue of intimidation. The man reached the top, breathing hard. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed his forehead. "Captain Marcus, I presume?" the man said, in perfect, unaccented English. Marcus didn't blink. "You know my name. I don't know yours." "Forgive me," the man said, extending a hand that Marcus ignored. "My name is Mr. Vance. I represent the Amazonia Resource Consortium, a holding company based in São Paulo." "You're a long way from the office, Mr. Vance," Marcus said. "We monitor land acquisitions in this sector," Vance said, looking past Marcus at the rusted hut. "We noticed a transaction this morning at the municipal office. Lot 7 Bravo. You bought it for $5, was it?" "It was a public auction," Marcus said. Yes. A delightful, quaint custom." Vance waved a hand dismissively. "But here is the situation, Captain. That purchase was a clerical error. My company has held the mineral rights to the surrounding 1,000 acres for years. We intended to buy this plot to complete our portfolio, but, well, our local agent was slow. You beat us to it." Vance reached into his jacket pocket. Marcus tensed, ready to draw. Vance pulled out a checkbook. "We want to correct this mistake," Vance said, clicking a gold pen. "We are prepared to buy the deed from you, right now. We know you paid $5. We are willing to offer you a substantial profit for your trouble." He wrote quickly, tore the check, and held it out. Marcus looked at the number. 50,000. $50,000 for a patch of mud and a rusted shed. It was a 10,000% return on investment in 4 hours. It was enough to buy a new boat, a new generator, supplies for a year. It was walk-away money. But Marcus didn't look at the money. He looked at Vance's eyes. They were too eager, too intense. A company like that doesn't pay 50 grand for a clerical error. They pay 50 grand to bury a secret. If they were offering 50, it meant the land was worth 5 million. "Why?" Marcus asked. "It's just a swamp. Why do you want it?" "Development," Vance lied smoothly. "We're planning an eco-resort. This hill is the perfect spot for the main lodge. It's just business, Captain. Real estate." Marcus looked back at the hut. He thought about the maps. He thought about the water testing equipment. An eco-resort didn't need geological surveys from 1943. "I'm not selling," Marcus said. Vance's smile faltered. "Excuse me?" "I said no," Marcus repeated. "I like the view." Vance stared at him. The veneer of politeness cracked. The eyes behind the sunglasses went cold. "You're making a mistake, Captain. A very expensive mistake. This isn't the United States. Property rights here are fluid. Accidents happen in the jungle. People get lost. Structures burn down." It was a threat. Veiled, but clear. Max stood up. He took a step toward Vance and let out a bark that sounded like a gunshot. Vance flinched, stepping back into the mud. "Get your dog under control," Vance snapped. "He is under control," Marcus said. "If he wasn't, you'd be bleeding." Marcus took a step forward, invading Vance's personal space. "Take your check," Marcus said quietly. "Take your boat." And tell your consortium that Lot 7 Bravo is under new management, and the new management shoots trespassers. Vance stared at him for a long moment. He put the check back in his pocket. He smoothed his suit jacket. 50,000 was the polite offer. Vance said softly. Next time, we won't bring a checkbook. We'll bring a bulldozer. He turned and walked back down the hill, his loafers sliding in the dirt. Marcus watched him go. He watched the speedboat roar away, disappearing around the bend. Yara stepped out of the hut. She stood beside him. He offered $50,000, Marcus told her. Yara looked at the retreating wake of the boat. Then there is something in the ground, she said. Something they are afraid you will find. Marcus turned back to the rusted hulk of the Quonset hut. Grab the shovels, Yara, he said, his face grim. We need to dig up the floor. We need to find out what we bought before they come back with the bulldozers. The rest of the afternoon was a war of attrition against concrete and time. Marcus had returned to the skiff to retrieve the heavy tools he always kept in the false bottom of the boat. A 10-pound sledgehammer, a pry bar, and a high-lift jack. He treated the renovation of the hut not as a construction project, but as a breaching operation. He was breaking into the past. The heat inside the metal shell of the Quonset hut was stifling, turning the air into a soup of dust and rust particles. Marcus swung the sledgehammer with a rhythmic, destructive cadence. Clang. Crack, clang. He was targeting a section of the floor near the rear wall, where the concrete looked slightly discolored, a hairline fracture that ran in a perfect square. Nature doesn't crack in perfect squares. Man does. Yara worked beside him, clearing the rubble with a shovel. She didn't complain about the dust coating her skin or the blisters forming on her hands. She worked with a fierce intensity, driven by the knowledge that $50,000 had been offered for this patch of dirt. In her experience, men in suits only offered that kind of money when they were trying to steal something worth millions. They aren't looking for gold, she said, tossing a shovel load of concrete chunks aside. Gold is in the riverbed. This is a hill. Why do they want the hill? Strategic position, Marcus grunted, swinging the hammer, or whatever is under this slab. Max was agitated. The noise of the hammer echoed painfully in the metal dome, but the dog refused to leave. He paced around the square crack, whining, digging at the stone with his claws. He smelled something coming from the fissure, a scent that Marcus couldn't detect through the dust mask he was wearing. It wasn't the smell of rot or chemicals. It was a cold, clean scent. Around 1800 hours, the sledgehammer broke through. A chunk of concrete the size of a dinner plate fell away, revealing darkness underneath. It wasn't earth. It was a void. Marcus knelt, shining his flashlight into the hole. It's a false floor, he said. There's a sub-level. He grabbed the pry bar. He jammed it into the hole and heaved. The slab was heavy, reinforced with rebar, but the concrete around the edges had crumbled with age. With a groan of effort that strained every tendon in his back, Marcus lifted the edge of the slab. "Yara, the jack!" he shouted. She slid the mechanical jack under the lip of the concrete. She cranked the handle. Click, click, click. The machine took the weight. The heavy slab rose, tilting upward like the lid of a stone sarcophagus. A rush of air escaped the opening. It didn't smell like a tomb. It smelled like the beginning of the world. It smelled of wet stone, deep earth, and rushing water. Marcus peered into the opening. A rusted iron ladder led down about 10 feet into a small, circular chamber, lined with brick. "Stay up top," Marcus told Yara. "Watch the door." He descended. The air grew cooler with every step. When his boots hit the floor of the chamber, the temperature was 20 degrees lower than the surface. He swept the light around. The chamber wasn't a bunker for people. It was a utility room. In the center, dominating the space, was a massive industrial pipe assembly capped with a wheel valve the size of a truck tire. Gauges, their glass faces cracked but readable, were attached to the manifold. Marcus wiped the dust from a brass plaque riveted to the main pipe. U.S. Army Engineers, Aquifer Access Point, 7B, 1943, potable. He looked at the pressure gauge. The needle was pegged in the green. This wasn't just a well. This was a direct tap into a deep, artesian aquifer, a massive underground reservoir of pressurized water. In a region where surface water was often contaminated by mercury from illegal gold mining or parasites, a source of infinite, pure pressurized water was priceless. It was blue gold. But the consortium wouldn't pay 50 grand just for water. Marcus looked closer at the pipes. There was a secondary valve, smaller, labeled sample extraction. He turned the small tap. Water hissed out, clear and cold. But mixed with the water were tiny glittering flecks. Not gold. Niobium. The water was washing through a vein of rare earth minerals. The sediment in the filter trap was rich with it. Marcus realized the scale of the deception. The consortium didn't want the water. They wanted to use the water pressure to hydraulic mine the hill from the inside out, extracting the niobium, a critical metal for advanced technology, without anyone seeing the surface damage. They would hollow out the hill and leave a sinkhole. He climbed back up the ladder, his mind racing. He had bought a strategic resource. He pulled himself onto the main floor. Yara was waiting, holding the shotgun. She looked tense. "What is it?" she asked. "It's everything," Marcus said, dusting off his knees. "Water, minerals. They want to strip mine the hill." Before he could explain further, Max barked. A deep warning bark directed at the jungle outside. Marcus killed his light. He moved to the open door of the Quonset hut. The sun had set. The jungle was a wall of black. But in the distance to the south, there was a sound. It wasn't a boat engine. It was the low, grinding roar of heavy diesel machinery moving over land. The sound of trees snapping and gears shifting. "Do you hear that?" Yara whispered, standing beside him. "Bulldozers," Marcus said. Vance wasn't lying. They were cutting a road. The consortium wasn't waiting for a legal sale. They were pushing a road through the jungle, illegally, straight toward Lot 7 Bravo. They were coming to take the hill by force of eminent domain or simple occupation. If they cleared the land, they could claim it was improved and seize it. Marcus looked at the rusted hut. It was just a shell. It couldn't stop a D9 Caterpillar dozer, but he was a combat engineer, and he had a source of high-pressure water and a defensible hill. "They're coming," Marcus said, watching the faint glow of headlights through the trees miles away. "It will take them all night to cut through the swamp." "What do we do?" Yara asked. "Run?" "No," Marcus said. "We dig in." He turned back to the dark interior of the hut. "Yara, find every hose, every pipe, every piece of metal you can. Max, patrol." Marcus walked back to the open hole in the floor. He looked down at the massive valve. "They want the water," he muttered to himself. "I'm going to give it to them." He wasn't going to build a fence. He was going to build a water cannon. The sound of a bulldozer in the jungle is a specific kind of violence. It doesn't sound like a vehicle. It sounds like a prehistoric beast tearing the world apart. The snapping of century-old trees echoed like rifle shots through the humid night air. The consortium wasn't sending a diplomatic envoy. They were sending a Cat D9, a 50-ton wall of steel designed to flatten mountains. They were cutting a survey road, a legal loophole that allowed them to destroy the property to assess it. Inside the Quonset hut, Marcus was fighting a war of hydraulics. He had descended back into the aquifer chamber, wrestling with the rusted fittings of the main valve. He didn't have weapons to fight a bulldozer. A 5.5mm round would bounce off the blade like a pebble. He needed physics. "Yara, bring the fire hose!" Marcus shouted from the hole, his voice echoing in the metal shell. Yara dragged a heavy roll of canvas hose he had found in a locker marked Emergency Fire Control. It was old, stiff with age, but the rubber lining looked intact. Marcus connected the hose to the auxiliary output of the main pipe assembly. He used baling wire and duct tape to reinforce the coupling, praying the 50-year-old threads would hold the pressure. Above ground, Max was pacing the perimeter of the hill. The dog was barking at the approaching lights, a rhythmic, deep warning. He couldn't fight a machine, but he refused to retreat. He stood at the edge of the slope where the dry ground met the swamp that surrounded their position. Marcus climbed out of the hole. He dragged the nozzle end of the heavy hose to the front door of the hut. He lashed it to the metal frame of the doorway using ratchet straps, creating a fixed firing position. It looked crude, a brass nozzle aimed at the dark tree line, but Marcus knew the math. The pressure gauge downstairs read 120 psi static. If he opened the valve fully, that nozzle would throw water with enough force to strip bark off a tree or knock a man flat. But against a bulldozer, he needed more than impact. He needed saturation. The noise grew deafening. The ground vibrated, shaking dust from the corrugated ceiling. "They are at the tree line," Yara said, gripping the handle of a shovel. She looked small against the approaching mechanical roar, but she stood her ground. "They are going to push the hut over the cliff." "They have to cross the mud first," Marcus said. A massive tree at the edge of the clearing shuddered and fell, crashing down with a sound that shook the earth. Through the gap, blinding LED floodlights pierced the darkness. The yellow blade of the bulldozer emerged from the foliage, pushing a mound of soil and broken wood ahead of it. It paused at the edge of the moat, the low-lying, swampy area that separated the jungle from Marcus's hill. The machine revved, black smoke pouring from its stack. The driver was revving the engine, testing the ground. He dropped the blade and began to push forward, intending to fill the swamp with debris to create a land bridge. "Now!" Marcus yelled. He spun the wheel valve on the hose assembly. The hose jumped like a living snake as the pressure hit it. Water exploded from the nozzle, a solid white jet of high-velocity liquid. Marcus didn't aim at the bulldozer. He aimed at the ground in front of it. He aimed at the swamp. The jet of water hit the mud with the sound of a continuous explosion. It churned the earth, liquefying the soil instantly. Marcus swept the stream back and forth, turning the semi-solid ground that the bulldozer was trying to cross into a soup of quicksand. He was hydraulically mining the earth under the machine's tracks. The bulldozer driver, blinded by the spray and confident in his 50 tons of steel, pushed forward. It was a fatal error. The left track of the massive machine hit the liquefied zone Marcus had created. The ground gave way. The 50-ton beast didn't drive. It sank. The engine roared as the driver tried to back up, but the tracks just spun, digging a deeper grave in the soup. The machine tilted violently to the left, sliding sideways into the trench Marcus was carving with the water cannon. "Hold the line!" Marcus gritted his teeth, wrestling with the bucking hose. The water pressure was immense, bruising his ribs as he leaned into the strap. The bulldozer groaned, metal twisting. It slid further, the engine intake swamped by mud and water. With a final sputtering cough, the diesel engine died. The lights flickered and went out. Silence slammed back into the clearing, broken only by the hiss of the water jet. Marcus closed the valve. The stream died. In the moonlight, the massive yellow machine sat dead in the mud, half buried, tilted at a 45-degree angle like a sunken ship. The driver scrambled out of the cab, covered in slime, slipping and falling as he scrambled back toward the solid ground of the tree line. He didn't look back. He ran. Marcus leaned against the door frame, his arms shaking from the exertion. Yara stared at the defeated machine. "You drowned it," she said, in awe. "I just added water," Marcus said, wiping spray from his face. The mud did the rest. Max ran down the hill, barking at the retreating driver, ensuring the retreat was permanent. Marcus looked at the hose. The coupling was leaking. The old rubber had almost burst. It wouldn't hold another siege. But they had bought time. The consortium had sent a machine to clear the land. Marcus had turned the land against the machine. "They won't come back tonight," Marcus said. "They need a crane to get that thing out." He looked at the hut. It was still standing. "We have until morning to secure the legal claim," Marcus told Yara. "Once the sun is up, they'll send lawyers, not drivers. We need to make this place untouchable. He looked at the water dripping from the nozzle. Pure, clean, infinite. We aren't building a fortress anymore, Marcus decided. We're building a utility. If we turn this into a public water station for the village, they can't bulldoze it without starting a riot. He had won the battle of brute force. Now, he had to win the battle of hearts and minds. The sun rose over the clearing, illuminating the yellow carcass of the 50-ton bulldozer sunk to its axles in the solidified mud. It was a monument to hubris, a metal statue that screamed failure to anyone who looked up the hill. But Marcus knew that shame wouldn't stop the consortium. It would only make them angrier. They would come back with lawyers, with police, with court orders declaring the land a hazard. They would use paper to destroy what steel could not. To win this war, Marcus needed an army, but he didn't have money to hire mercenaries, and he didn't trust them anyway. He needed an army that couldn't be bought. He walked into the aquifer chamber. He filled 25-gallon jerry cans with the cold, crystal-clear water gushing from the 1943 valve. "What are we doing?" Yara asked, wiping soot from her face. "We are going to town," Marcus said, screwing a cap on tight. "We are going to give it away." In the river town of São Gabriel, water was everywhere, but none of it was safe. The river was brown with silt and poisoned by the mercury runoff from the illegal gold barges upstream. The municipal supply was sporadic and smelled of chlorine. People bought bottled water at exorbitant prices or boiled the river water and prayed. When Marcus's skiff pulled up to the main floating dock, people watched with suspicion. They knew him as the crazy gringo who bought the swamp. They saw the mud on his clothes and the grim set of his jaw. Marcus unloaded the cans. He didn't say a word. He set up a folding table. He poured a glass of water. It was perfectly clear, sparkling in the sun. He drank it down in one long draught. He refilled the glass and set it on the edge of the table. "Free," Marcus said to the crowd gathering. "Cold, clean, no mercury, no parasites." A woman came forward, holding a baby. She looked at Marcus, then at Yara. Yara nodded. The woman drank. Her eyes widened. It tasted like rain. It tasted like life. Within 20 minutes, the cans were empty. "Where does this come from?" the woman asked. "From the hill," Marcus said. "Lot 7 Bravo. The consortium wants to bulldoze it to dig for metal. If they do, the water stops." The message spread faster than fire in dry season. The narrative changed instantly. Marcus wasn't the invader hoarding land. He was the guardian of the spring. The consortium wasn't a developer bringing jobs. They were thieves stealing the water. "I need pipe," Marcus told the crowd. "I need PVC. I need hands. If we run a line from the hill to the river, we can fill a tank here every day. Gravity does the work." By noon, a flotilla of canoes and small boats was heading upriver toward Marcus's inlet. Men brought tools, spare pipes, and shovels. Women brought food. It was an impromptu construction battalion. They worked through the heat of the day. Marcus directed the operation like a combat engineer, laying out the line, calculating the gradient. They ran 300 yards of PVC pipe from the Quonset hut, down the steep slope to a tap stand they built on the riverbank. At 1500 hours, Marcus opened the main valve inside the bunker. Water rushed down the pipe. At the bottom of the hill, the tap sputtered, hissed air, and then flowed with a steady, strong stream of cold water. The locals cheered. They washed their faces. They filled their jugs. That was when the speedboat returned. This time, Mr. Vance wasn't alone. He brought 2 local police officers and a man in a cheap suit holding a briefcase. Vance stepped onto the bank, looking at the pipeline, looking at the crowd of 50 locals drinking the water. His face went pale. He knew exactly what had happened. He had lost the narrative. "This is an illegal modification of private property," the lawyer screamed, waving a paper. "We have an injunction to cease operations." The police officers looked at the paper. Then they looked at the crowd. These were their neighbors, their cousins. They looked at the water. One of the officers took off his cap and wiped his brow. "It's hot," the officer said. He walked to the tap and took a drink. He looked at Vance. "This is good water, public utility." "This man is squatting," Vance shouted, pointing at Marcus. Marcus stood at the top of the ramp, Max by his side. He held up the deed, the $5 piece of paper. "I own the land," Marcus said, his voice carrying over the water. "And under Brazilian law, water for human consumption is a fundamental right. You can't shut it off, not without a federal judge, and that takes months." Vance looked at the bulldozer still stuck in the mud, a symbol of his impotence. He looked at the villagers forming a wall between him and Marcus. He realized that if he ordered the police to break the pipe, he would start a riot he couldn't survive. The lawyer whispered something in Vance's ear. Vance nodded, tight-lipped. "We'll see you in court, Captain." Vance hissed. "Bring a water bottle." Marcus replied dryly. "It's a long wait." The speedboat reversed and left. The police officers stayed to fill their canteens. Marcus sat down on the steps of the Quonset hut. Yara sat beside him. "You started a revolution," she said, handing him a plate of food the village women had cooked. "I just laid a pipe," Marcus said. "No," she corrected. "You gave them something to protect. Now, if the consortium attacks you, they attack the village." Marcus looked at the rusted metal walls of the hut. It wasn't just a bunker anymore. It was a utility station. A community center, a fortress garrisoned by the people. He had bought it for $5 to be a hideout. It had become the most public place on the river. And for the first time, the ex-SEAL didn't mind the crowd. He realized that the best perimeter defense wasn't a tripwire. It was a neighbor. The humidity inside the Quonset hut wasn't just suspended water. It was the breath of decades of secrets rotting in the dark. After the defeat of the bulldozer in the swamp, the silence that returned to the hill was taut, like the calm before an artillery barrage. Marcus knew the consortium wouldn't send another dozer. They would send something surgical, something that left no tracks. He descended back into the aquifer chamber. He didn't stop at the main water valve. Using the tactical light mounted on his rifle, he began inspecting the exposed brick walls. Where the 1943 military engineering project ended, something darker began. The lead vault behind a deactivated electrical panel, coated in thick spiderwebs and oxidation, Marcus found what Vance actually wanted. It wasn't a standard safe. It was a steel box lined with lead, anchored directly into the bedrock. "Yara, get down here," Marcus called up, his voice echoing metallically in the shaft. "Bring the pry bar." Together, they forced the lid. The shriek of yielding metal sounded like a scream in the confined space. Inside, wrapped in vacuum-sealed military-grade plastic, there was no gold. There was paper, logbooks, detailed survey maps, and canisters of microfilm dated 1968, the height of the Brazilian military dictatorship and the Cold War. As he flipped through the documents, Marcus's face, usually a mask of indifference, paled under his tan. The 1943 Rubber Soldier Project had just been the cover story later on. In 1968, the consortium, operating under a different name and backed by high-ranking generals, had used this isolated hill as a tactical disposal site. They had experimentally extracted niobium, but the process generated a highly toxic byproduct, a chemical sludge injected deep into the substrata to hide the evidence from surface inspectors. Those crystal-clear waters Marcus was distributing to the village were the only geological cap, preventing the toxic waste from leaching into the Rio Negro tributaries. If the consortium began hydraulic mining, they would rupture that seal, poisoning the entire Amazon basin just to get at the ore. The consortium didn't want the land to build. They wanted the land to bury the crime forever. The sound arrived first, the rhythmic thumping of rotor blades. It wasn't Vance's luxury chopper. It was a Eurocopter AS-350, painted matte black, flying low, running without navigation lights. "Max, position!" Marcus ordered. The dog bolted into the brush, becoming a ghost among the ferns. Yara grabbed the AR-15, her posture firm. She was no longer the scared woman on the auction platform. She was the guardian of this water. The helicopter didn't land. 4 shadows slid down fast ropes directly onto the curved metallic roof of the Quonset hut. The sound of boots impacting zinc reverberated like thunder inside the bunker. They were professionals, mercenaries from Ethelred Solutions, the private security firm Marcus knew too well from his service days. Marcus didn't use bullets yet. He used what the bunker provided, pressure. He opened the sample extraction valve to maximum flow, but instead of venting the water outside, he diverted it into the hut's ventilation system, which he had rigged hours earlier. Cold steam and pressurized mist flooded the interior of the hut in seconds, creating a dense whiteout where the mercenaries' night vision goggles would useless into a blinding wall of static. The first mercenary breached through the skylight. Marcus was waiting in the shadows of the fog. With fluid movement, he used the stock of his rifle to disarm the man, slamming him against the curved metal wall. The noise alerted the others, but Max was already on them. The German Shepherd attacked from the fog, not to kill, but to destabilize, biting legs and forearms, turning the hut into a labyrinth of pain and confusion for the intruders. The fight was short and brutal. Marcus wasn't a murderer. He was an impassable obstacle. With 3 mercenaries incapacitated on the concrete floor and the 4th retreating into the jungle, Marcus climbed to the roof. Vance was in the helicopter, hovering 60 feet up, watching the chaos through thermal binoculars. Marcus didn't aim his rifle at the chopper. He simply held up one of the 1968 logbooks, illuminating it with a burning magnesium flare. He keyed the mic of the shortwave radio he had salvaged from the lab. "Vance, I know you're listening." Marcus's voice roared over the emergency frequency. "I don't just have the niobium. I have the names. I have the disposal logs from 68. I have the signatures of your consortium's founders and the generals who helped them hide it. The helicopter hesitated in the air. "If this flare drops, or if I don't check in with Judge Alencar in Manaus every 6 hours, these documents, scanned and encrypted, go to the international press, the Hague Tribunal, and every environmental watchdog group on the planet. You won't just lose the mine, you'll spend the rest of your life in a 2x2-meter cell." There was a long silence on the radio, just the sound of the rotors cutting the humid air. "What do you want, Captain?" Vance's voice came back dry, stripped of its former arrogance. "I want peace," Marcus replied. "This sector, from 7 Bravo to the village boundary, is now an independent community reserve. You will fund the filtration station and the village school. In exchange, the vault stays closed. If a single man in a suit or a single tactical boot steps in this mud again, the whole world learns what you buried here." The helicopter dipped its nose toward the south. Vance didn't say goodbye. He simply left, disappearing into the vast green expanse of the Amazon. He knew Marcus wasn't bluffing. A man who lives with ghosts doesn't fear the future. 6 months later, Sector 7 Bravo was unrecognizable. The Quonset hut had been restored, not as a military base, but as the Sector 7 water station. Modern piping carried purified water to every riverbank community within a 30-mile radius. Marcus sat on the porch of his new cabin, built at the crest of the hill, overlooking the Rio Negro. The tremor in his right hand was completely gone. The discipline of the work and the purpose of protecting something larger than himself had done what years of VA therapy could not. Yara walked up from the filtration station, holding a clipboard. She now coordinated the native seed project she had started with what she recovered from her village. She looked at Marcus and smiled. "We have visitors tomorrow," she said. "Judge Alencar is coming to see the new school." "Max will meet them on the trail," Marcus replied, scratching the head of the massive dog resting by his side. He looked at the horizon. He was still a soldier, but the war had changed. He no longer fought for flags or ideologies he didn't understand. He fought for the ground beneath his boots and the people who drank the water it held. Sector 7. Bravo had been purchased for $5. But for Marcus, it was the place where he had finally bought his freedom.